In the annals of the Roman Empire, there are stories of glorious conquest, of cities built from dust, and of civilization carved into the savage frontiers of the known world. These are the tales Rome told itself, the grand narrative of its divine destiny. But there are other stories, whispered in the shadowed halls of the Palatine Hill and etched into the grim faces of legionaries who survived the darkness. These are the stories of hubris, of failure, and of places where the Roman eagle, the proud symbol of its invincibility, was torn from the sky and dragged through the mud and blood of defeat. No story is more potent, more haunting, than that of the Teutoburg Forest, a name that would become synonymous with annihilation, a wound on the Roman psyche that would never truly heal. And this story, like so many tragedies, begins not with the clash of swords, but with the arrival of one man, an administrator whose ambition and arrogance would lead 3 legions into oblivion. His name was Publius Quinctilius Varus. In the summer of 9 AD, he arrived in the heart of Germania, a land of sprawling, dark forests, treacherous swamps, and fiercely independent tribes. This was not a land of cities and senates, but of clan loyalties and ancient, blood-soaked traditions that Rome, in its supreme confidence, believed it could tame. Varus was the embodiment of that confidence. He was no stranger to power or governance. Born into an old, patrician family that had fallen on hard times, he had clawed his way back to prominence through a combination of political acumen and, most importantly, a direct connection to the imperial family itself. He had married Vipsania Marcella, the daughter of Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, Emperor Augustus's most trusted general and right-hand man. This union placed Varus in the emperor's inner circle, a position of immense privilege and expectation. His career had been a textbook example of Roman provincial administration. He had served as governor of Africa, a peaceful and prestigious post, before being assigned to the far more volatile province of Syria. There, he had commanded a large garrison of 4 legions and had earned a reputation for being both a stern administrator and a ruthless enforcer of Roman will. When a messianic revolt broke out in the client kingdom of Judea following the death of Herod the Great, Varus marched his legions south. He crushed the rebellion with brutal efficiency, culminating in the mass crucifixion of 2,000 Jewish rebels. The act was meant as a terrifying message: Rome's peace was to be kept, and the price for disturbing it was death in its most agonizing form. To his supporters in Rome, it was a sign of his strength and decisiveness. To his detractors, and to the people he subjugated, it was a sign of a cruel and inflexible nature, a man who saw nails and wood as the primary tools of diplomacy. Now, Augustus had given him a new, even more challenging assignment: the governorship of Germania. For 20 years, Rome had been pushing its frontiers east of the Rhine River. Under the brilliant generalship of Augustus's stepsons, Tiberius and Drusus, Roman legions had marched deep into the German heartland, establishing forts, building roads, and forcing treaties upon the various tribes: the Cherusei, the Marsi, the Chatti. By 9 AD, Rome considered the region to be essentially pacified. The time for conquest, it was believed, was over. The time for consolidation had begun. And for this task, Augustus chose Varus. He was not sent as a general to wage war, but as a governor to build a province. His mission was to transform this wild, tribal land into a taxable, orderly, Roman-style society. He was to introduce Roman law, establish a formal system of taxation, and adjudicate disputes among the tribesmen, treating them not as conquered enemies, but as new subjects of the empire. As Varus's entourage made its way to the summer headquarters near the Weser River, the man himself projected an aura of unshakable authority. He was in his late 50s, a career politician who had grown comfortable with the trappings of power. He traveled not as a soldier living among soldiers, but as a dignitary. His baggage train was laden with the comforts of Roman life: fine wines, luxurious fabrics, and the administrative paraphernalia of a burgeoning bureaucracy: scribes, clerks, tax collectors, and lawyers. He saw himself as a bringer of civilization, a firm but fair hand that would guide these rough, uncultured people into the enlightened embrace of Roman order. He failed to understand a fundamental truth of the land he had been sent to rule: the Germans did not want to be guided. They did not want Roman laws to replace their ancient customs, nor did they want Roman tax collectors seizing a portion of their harvests and cattle. They had bent the knee to Roman military might, but in their hearts, they had not been broken. The legionaries of the 17th, 18th, and 19th legions watched their new commander with a mixture of professional respect and quiet apprehension. These were veteran units, hardened by years of campaigning in the unforgiving German wilderness. They knew the land and its people. They understood the deceptive calm of the forests and the simmering resentment that lay just beneath the surface of tribal compliance. They were used to commanders like Tiberius, a man who slept on the ground with his troops and understood the ever-present threat of ambush. Varus was different. He conducted his business from a raised tribunal, dispensing Roman justice with an air of detached superiority. He held court and settled property disputes between tribesmen who had for centuries settled their affairs with spears, not statutes. He saw their deference as acceptance. He mistook their silence for submission. He could not see the cold fury that hid behind their lowered eyes as they were forced to submit to the judgments of a foreign master in a language they barely understood. Varus was a lawyer in a land that respected only warriors, a taxman in a land that valued only freedom. This fundamental disconnect, this chasm between his perception and their reality, was the first crack in the foundation of Roman authority in Germania, a crack that would soon rupture into a cataclysm. The governor had arrived, and with him, he had brought the seeds of his own destruction. The forest was watching, and it was waiting that I end the grand theater of Roman power, where men like Quinctilius Varus played their designated roles with predictable certainty. There moved a figure of profound and dangerous ambiguity. He was a man forged in the crucible of two irreconcilable worlds, a living paradox who walked the line between loyalty and betrayal with the grace of a predator. To the Romans, he was a symbol of their civilizing mission, a testament to their ability to absorb and elevate the very people they conquered. To his own people, he was something far more complex, a source of both pride and suspicion, a warrior prince who wore the uniform of the enemy. His name was Arminius, and he was the architect of Rome's greatest nightmare. Born in 18 or 17 BC, Arminius was the son of Segimur, a chieftain of the Cherusei, one of the most powerful and respected Germanic tribes residing near the Weser River. He was not born into the squalor that many Romans imagined defined the Germanic existence. He was tribal aristocracy, raised with the expectation of leadership, trained from boyhood in the arts of war, how to wield a spear, how to track game through the dense forests, and how to command the fierce loyalty of his kinsmen. His world was one of ancient rites, of gods who dwelled in sacred groves, and of a social order built not on written law, but on sacred oaths and the unyielding bonds of blood. It was a world that Rome was systematically dismantling. As part of the Roman strategy for pacifying Germania, it was common practice to take the sons of tribal leaders as hostages. It was a clever, insidious policy. These young nobles were not imprisoned in chains, but were taken to Rome itself, where they were given a first-class Roman education. They learned to speak flawless Latin, studied rhetoric and military strategy, and were granted the high honor of Roman citizenship, a privilege many in the empire coveted. The goal was twofold: to ensure the good behavior of their fathers back home, and to create a new generation of Romanized native leaders who would willingly integrate their people into the imperial machine. Arminius and his younger brother, Flavius, were two such hostages. For Arminius, this was not a period of subjugation, but of transformation. He was thrust into the heart of the most powerful city on earth, a sprawling metropolis of marble and might that stood in stark contrast to the wooden longhouses of his homeland. He proved to be an exceptional student of the Roman way. He was intelligent, charismatic, and possessed a natural aptitude for military command. He absorbed Roman tactics, understood Roman logistics, and learned to navigate the complex social hierarchies of the Roman elite. He did not merely learn to be a Roman, he excelled at it. He joined the Roman army, serving as a commander of an auxiliary cavalry unit composed of his fellow Germans. He fought for Rome, shedding blood for the empire in its campaigns in Pannonia, a brutal and grueling war that earned him not only a reputation for courage but also the prestigious status of an Ikes, a Knight of Rome. He was, in every outward appearance, the perfect product of the Roman system. When he spoke, it was with the educated accent of a Roman noble. When he commanded his troops, it was with the discipline and authority of a Roman officer. He could dine with men like Varus, discussing philosophy or military history, holding his own in their sophisticated world. The Romans saw him and saw success. They saw a German who had wisely chosen civilization over barbarism, order over chaos. They saw a trusted ally, a vital bridge between the Roman administration and the inscrutable tribes of the north. Varus, in particular, came to rely on him heavily. Arminius became a member of the governor's inner circle, a constant presence at his side, advising him on the customs and politics of the various tribes. He was the friendly face of the conquered, the reassuring voice that told Varus everything was under control. But beneath the polished veneer of the Roman knight, the heart of a Cheruscan chieftain still beat with a fierce and secret fire. While Rome saw a convert, Arminius saw an opportunity. His years in the empire had not erased his identity, they had sharpened it. He had not been seduced by Rome's power, he had studied it. He learned its strengths, but more importantly, he learned its weaknesses. He saw its arrogance, its dismissive attitude towards those it deemed barbarians. He understood its reliance on logistics, its vulnerability in unfamiliar terrain, and its psychological need for decisive, open-field battles. He saw the contempt with which administrators like Varus treated his people, imposing taxes that felt like theft and laws that felt like sacrilege. While his brother, Flavius, would remain genuinely loyal to Rome for the rest of his life, a choice that would forever brand him a traitor in the eyes of his own people, Arminius made a different choice. His loyalty was a mask. Every day he spent in Varus's camp was a masterclass in espionage. He listened to the conversations, noted the troop movements, and gauged the governor's overconfident and complacent mindset. He moved between two worlds with a chilling duality. In the Roman camp, he was Arminius, the Roman citizen, the trusted commander, the friend of the governor. But when he rode out from the camp, ostensibly to patrol the countryside or confer with local leaders, he became something else entirely. He became the son of Segimur, the prince of the Cherusci. He was secretly meeting with other chieftains, men who chafed under Roman rule, men whose pride had been wounded and whose patience had run thin. He was using his intimate knowledge of Roman strategy and his unique position of trust to weave a conspiracy of breathtaking audacity. He was not just planning a rebellion, he was planning an annihilation. He was a ghost moving in plain sight, a patriot disguised as a collaborator. The Romans saw a tame wolf, loyal and obedient. They failed to see that he was merely learning the ways of the shepherd before leading the entire flock to slaughter. Beyond the ordered geometry of the Roman summer camp, with its neat rows of tents and its disciplined sentry patrols, lay the true Germania. It was a realm that existed in the shadows, in the sacred, untouched groves where the gods of the old world were said to dwell, and in the smoky interiors of wooden longhouses where the real power of the land resided. It was here, far from the arrogant gaze of Quinctilius Varus, that the seeds of rebellion, so carefully planted by Arminius, began to take root and grow in the fertile soil of resentment. This was not a grand council of a unified nation, for Germania was not one people, but a fractured mosaic of tribes, each with its own king, its own ambitions, and its own long-standing rivalries. The conspiracy was a thing of whispers, of secret journeys through the night, and of oaths sworn by the light of a flickering fire. Arminius, in his dual role as Roman officer and Germanic prince, became the weaver of this deadly tapestry. His movements were fluid and cloaked in legitimacy. He would ride out from Varus's headquarters, his Roman cavalry cloak billowing behind him, on missions sanctioned by the governor himself, to mediate a dispute, to confirm tribal allegiances, or to scout new routes for Roman patrols. But his true purpose lay in the clandestine meetings he held under the cover of darkness. He sought out the other chieftains, men of influence and martial pride, leaders of tribes like the Marsi, the Chatti, and the Bructeri. These were warriors who had fought the Romans for a generation. They had seen their lands occupied, their warriors slain, and their traditions eroded by the relentless advance of the legions. They had submitted, but they had not surrendered. The meetings were fraught with danger and distrust. Arminius was not universally welcomed. To many, he was a symbol of capitulation. He wore Roman armor, spoke the Roman tongue, and held Roman honors. How could they trust a man who had seemingly become one of them? They looked at him and saw the face of their own potential subjugation. One of the most powerful dissenting voices was that of his own uncle, Segestes. Segestes was a pragmatist, a man who believed that resisting Rome was suicidal. He had chosen a path of collaboration, hoping to secure a position of power for himself and his family within the new Roman order. He saw Arminius not as a liberator, but as a reckless firebrand whose actions would bring ruin upon them all. The tension between them was not just political, it was deeply personal. Arminius had defied Segestes' authority by eloping with his daughter, thus Nelda, a woman who had been promised to another. It was an act of love, but also an act of political defiance, a declaration that Arminius would not bow to the old, collaborationist ways that end these secret gatherings. Arminius had to use every ounce of his Roman-honed rhetorical skill. He did not appeal to them as a Roman knight, but as a fellow German, a son of their soil. He spoke of the indignities they were suffering. He reminded them of the new taxes, a concept alien and insulting to a people who measured wealth in cattle and honor, not in coins to be handed over to a foreign administrator. He spoke of Varus's courts, where Roman law, complex and arbitrary, was imposed over their own ancient customs. He painted a vivid picture of a future where their sons would be conscripted to fight and die for an empire that held them in contempt, and their sacred groves would be cut down to make way for Roman roads and Roman forts. He spoke of their freedom, the one ideal that could unite even the most bitter of tribal rivals. He countered their fear with logic, a cold, hard logic learned from his enemies. He explained that Rome's strength was also its weakness. The legions were invincible in an open field, yes, but they were not invincible in the heart of a forest, stretched out in a long, vulnerable column. He knew their formations, their procedures, their mindset. He knew that Varus was complacent, insulated by his own arrogance and by the reassurances of his most trusted German advisor, Arminius himself. He laid out a plan that was both simple and terrifyingly effective. They would not meet the Romans in a pitched battle. They would lure them into a trap, a place where their discipline and numbers would count for nothing, a place where the very land itself would become a weapon. Slowly, painstakingly, he won them over. He appealed to their pride as warriors, to their duty as leaders, and to their fear of cultural annihilation. He forged a fragile alliance, a coalition of tribes bound not by friendship, but by a shared hatred of Rome. They swore their oaths, a sacred pact sealed in blood and shadow. They would gather their warriors in secret, hiding their numbers and their intent. They would wait for Arminius's signal. The plan was set in motion. While Varus sat in his comfortable headquarters, drafting decrees and counting tax revenues, a phantom army was coalescing in the dark heart of the forest. Every whisper in the night, every secret handshake, every warrior sharpening his spear in a hidden camp, was another thread in the net that was closing around the 17th, 18th, and 19th legions. The conspiracy was alive, breathing in the darkness, waiting for the moment to strike. For Quinctilius Varus, the summer of 9 AD was proceeding exactly as planned. His world, the world he had constructed in the heart of Germania, was one of order, progress, and the reassuring hum of imperial administration. The warnings of potential unrest, brought to him by a few junior officers or by nervous tribal collaborators like Segestes, were dismissed as little more than the predictable grumblings of a people being lifted from ignorance. He saw such dissent not as a sign of genuine danger, but as the growing pains of civilization taking root. His confidence was a fortress, its walls built high with Roman exceptionalism and cemented by the smiling deference of his most trusted native advisor, Arminius. The peace Varus perceived was not real, it was a meticulously crafted illusion, and he was its most willing and important audience. For Quinctilius Varus, the summer of 9 AD was proceeding exactly as planned. His world, the world he had constructed in the heart of Germania, was one of order, progress, and the reassuring hum of imperial administration. The warnings of potential unrest, brought to him by a few junior officers or by nervous tribal collaborators like Segestes, were dismissed as little more than the predictable grumblings of a people being lifted from ignorance. He saw such dissent not as a sign of genuine danger, but as the growing pains of civilization taking root. His confidence was a fortress, its walls built high with Roman exceptionalism and cemented by the smiling deference of his most trusted native advisor, Arminius. The peace Varus perceived was not real, it was a meticulously crafted illusion, and he was its most willing and important audience. The governor's days were filled with the mundane yet essential tasks of provincial rule. He would hold court from his tribunal, a raised platform that elevated him, both literally and figuratively, above the petitioners who came before him. German tribesmen, men accustomed to settling disputes through clan councils or personal combat, were now compelled to present their cases according to the rigid procedures of Roman law. They stood awkwardly before him, their arguments translated by an interpreter, as Varus listened with a detached, judicial air. He would pass judgment on land boundaries, on stolen livestock, on matters of inheritance, imposing a foreign logic upon a society that did not share its foundational principles. He saw this as the noble work of bringing justice and order to the unenlightened. He did not see the simmering humiliation in the eyes of a chieftain forced to accept the ruling of an outsider, or the quiet fury of a family whose ancestral claims were nullified by a piece of Roman parchment. The evenings were a different affair, a time for Varus to relax and enjoy the company of his inner circle. These were not the Spartan gatherings of a general on campaign, but lavish dinners befitting a man of his station. The finest wines, imported from the sun-drenched vineyards of Italy, flowed freely. The conversation was that of educated Roman elites, filled with talk of politics in the capital, of poetry, philosophy, and the latest gossip from the imperial court. And at the heart of this circle, a frequent and honored guest, was Arminius. Here, the German prince was at his most brilliant, his performance at its most convincing. He would shed the persona of the fierce Cheruscan warrior and don the mask of the urbane Roman knight. He would recline on a couch beside the governor, sharing a cup of wine, laughing at his jokes. He engaged in the sophisticated banter, his Latin as polished as any man in the room. He would offer Varus his insights into the Germanic mind, explaining tribal customs in a way that was both informative and reassuringly simplistic. He would confirm the governor's own biases, agreeing that the tribes were slowly but surely accepting the benefits of Roman rule. He would speak of the minor malcontents, in the hinterlands as backward traditionalists, isolated figures who posed no real threat to the overwhelming power of Rome. He was the ultimate informant, the native voice that validated every one of Varus's flawed assumptions. He was a friend, a confidant, a brother in arms who had fought for the glory of the empire. The summer was drawing to a close. The air was beginning to carry the first, subtle chill of autumn, a signal to the Roman legions that it was time to break their summer encampment near the Weser River and march west. Their destination was Aliso, a major supply depot and fortress closer to the Rhine, where they would spend the winter months in secure, well-stocked quarters. This was a routine maneuver, an annual migration that marked the changing of the seasons in the Roman military calendar. The legions had done it before. It was a march of consolidation, not of conquest, a final administrative tour through a pacified province before the snows came. For the conspirators, this was the moment they had been waiting for. The time for whispers was over. The time for action had arrived. The lure had to be cast. The plan, devised by Arminius with a chilling understanding of the Roman psyche, was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. It relied not on brute force, but on exploiting Varus's own self-assuredness and his complete trust in his German advisor. The conspiracy would not reveal itself in a direct challenge or a grand declaration of war. It would manifest as a problem that only a Roman governor could solve, a situation that demanded his immediate and personal attention. It began with a messenger, a German rider galloping into the Roman camp, his face a mask of feigned panic. He brought news of a rebellion, but not a large or threatening one. It was a minor, localized uprising, he claimed, in a territory to the north, among a tribe that was supposedly a Roman ally. The report was deliberately vague but filled with details calculated to provoke a specific response. It spoke of Roman merchants being attacked and small garrisons being threatened, an affront to Roman authority that could not be ignored. Varus received the news with predictable indignation. It was an annoyance, a final bit of tribal insolence that needed to be stamped out before he could conclude his work for the season. His senior officers, men with more experience in the treacherous landscape of Germania, likely advised caution. The standard procedure would be to send a cavalry detachment to investigate, or to stick to the established, well-scouted military roads leading back to the winter forts. A minor rebellion in a distant corner of the province was not worth diverting 3 entire legions, over 20,000 men, plus a massive baggage train, into uncharted territory. It was an unnecessary risk, a logistical nightmare. But Varus was not thinking like a cautious general. He was thinking like a governor whose authority had been challenged. He saw an opportunity to make one final, decisive show of force, to remind the Germans of the price of defiance before retiring for the winter. This was the critical moment, and Arminius played his role to perfection. He stood at Varus's side, the picture of calm competence and loyal counsel. When the governor asked for his opinion, Arminius validated Varus's own instincts. He agreed that the uprising, while minor, needed to be dealt with swiftly and decisively to prevent it from spreading. He dismissed the concerns of the other officers as overly cautious. Then he delivered the final, fatal piece of advice. He pointed to a map, a rough chart of the dense, sprawling forests that lay between their current position and the supposed site of the rebellion. There was, he explained, a shortcut. It was a lesser-known track that cut directly through the heart of the Teutoburg Forest. It would save them several days' march, allowing them to surprise the rebels and quell the disturbance with maximum efficiency. He presented it as a simple matter of logistics, a clever solution from a man who knew the local terrain better than any Roman. He would, of course, ride ahead with his own auxiliary cavalry, he assured the governor. He would secure the route, rally loyal German tribes to their cause, and prepare for the legion's arrival. It was a flawless proposal, appealing directly to Varus's desire for a quick, efficient, and dramatic resolution. To Varus, it must have seemed like the perfect plan, suggested by his most reliable ally. The idea of marching his legions through the dark, primordial forest did not seem to fill him with dread. On the contrary, what better way to demonstrate the reach and power of Rome than to carve a path directly through the heart of the German wilderness? The decision was made. Against the better judgment of his more experienced subordinates, Varus gave the order. The legions would not take the safe road home. They would divert. They would take the shortcut through the forest. It was a fateful choice, a single point of failure from which all the subsequent horror would flow. Varus was not just choosing a route on a map, he was choosing to walk willingly into a perfectly designed trap. He believed he was marching to crush a small rebellion. In reality, he was marching to his own execution. As Arminius prepared his cavalry to depart, a final, chilling exchange may have occurred. A handshake, a shared look of grim determination. Varus saw a loyal officer riding off to do his duty. Arminius saw a fool he was leading to the slaughter. The lure had been taken. The great, lumbering machine of the Roman army, with all its power and pride, turned its head and began to march towards the darkness that was waiting to swallow it whole. The order, once given, rippled through the camp like a tremor, setting in motion a vast and complex machinery of men and beasts. The decision to divert through the Teutoburg Forest was not a simple course correction. It was a monumental logistical undertaking. 3 full legions, the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th, were to move as one. This was not merely a fighting force, it was a city on the march. The numbers alone were staggering. At its core were the legionaries themselves, perhaps 15,000 strong, the disciplined heart of Roman military power. Each man was a walking arsenal, clad in his segmented armor, the larica segmentata, carrying his heavy shield, the scutum, his short, stabbing sword, the gladius, and his 2 weighted javelins, the pila. They were the most formidable soldiers in the known world, a force that had conquered continents through sheer discipline and relentless efficiency. But they were not alone. Accompanying them were the auxiliaries, cavalry and infantry units drawn from the non-citizen subjects of the empire, including the very German tribesmen commanded by Arminius. There were archers from Syria, slingers from the Balearic Islands, and horsemen from Gaul, a multinational force held together by the promise of pay and the ultimate prize of Roman citizenship. And then there was the tail, the vast, sprawling baggage train that was both the lifeblood and the Achilles heel of any Roman army on the move. This was not a lean, rapid deployment force. Varus was a governor concluding his seasonal administration, and he traveled with his entire provincial court. The train was laden with carts and wagons, pulled by thousands of mules and oxen, groaning under the weight of everything deemed necessary for Roman life on the frontier. There were the tools of war, tents, entrenching tools, mobile artillery pieces like the ballista and the Scorpio, and mountains of spare weapons and armor. There were the tools of administration, chests filled with tax records, legal documents, and the heavy bronze coins used to pay the soldiers. And there were the comforts of civilization, the governor's personal luxuries, fine pottery, wine amphorae, and the personal belongings of his staff. Most tragically, there were the people. Following the legions was a vast civilian contingent. These were the camp followers, a population that lived in the shadow of the army, merchants, artisans, servants, and, most vulnerably, the wives and children of the soldiers. For many legionaries who had been stationed in Germania for years, this was their home, and these were their families. They were not marching to a battle, they were relocating for the winter. The presence of these non-combatants transformed the column from a military instrument into a slow, vulnerable migration. On that fateful morning, as the sun rose over the plains of the Weser, the great column began to stir. The sound was immense, the trumpets blaring the signal to march, the shouted commands of the centurions, the lowing of cattle, the braying of mules, and the cries of children. The legions formed up, their polished helmets and eagle standards catching the morning light. They were a vision of imperial might, a river of steel and scarlet flowing across the land. The column, when fully assembled and on the move, would have stretched for an unimaginable length, perhaps 10 to 12 miles from the vanguard to the last wagon of the baggage train. It was a serpent of immense power, but also of immense vulnerability. Its strength lay in its cohesion, in its ability to form a solid, impenetrable battle line. But on a narrow track, stretched out over miles, its cohesion would be the first casualty as they left the familiar open ground of their summer camp and turned their faces towards the dark line of the forest on the horizon. A sense of unease may have begun to creep into the minds of the veteran soldiers. This was not the Roman way. Roman military doctrine was built on principles of caution and control. They built fortified camps every single night, no matter how deep they were in friendly territory. They marched on wide, cleared roads of their own construction, roads that offered clear fields of fire and prevented the possibility of a large-scale ambush. This, plunging into a dense, unknown forest on the advice of a native chieftain with their families in tow, was a violation of every instinct that had kept them alive on the brutal German frontier. But they were soldiers, and soldiers obey. Their faith was placed in the chain of command, in the authority of their centurions, their tribunes, and ultimately, in the governor who held their lives in his hands. They trusted in the system. They trusted in the eagle standards that flew above them, symbols of Rome's divine favor and invincibility. They put one foot in front of the other and marched. Varus, perhaps riding near the front of the column on his horse, would have looked back at the immense host following him and felt a surge of pride and power. This was his to command. This was the instrument of his will. He was leading more than 20,000 people into the wilderness, confident in his purpose, in his friend Arminius, and in the unshakable might of Rome. He did not know that he was leading them all on a funeral procession. The march had begun, and with every step, the legions drew closer to the maw of the trap that lay waiting for them in the deep, dark woods. Of course. Here is the 7th section of the full, immersive script for the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. 7. The sky weeps, music, the marching rhythm becomes heavier, slower. The sound of gentle rain begins, gradually growing in intensity to a torrential downpour. Distant, subtle thunder rumbles. Narrator. For the first few hours of the march, the sky held. But as the Roman column moved further from the open plains and closer to the brooding shadow of the forest, a change began to occur in the atmosphere. The air grew heavy, thick with a dampness that clung to the skin. The sun, which had shone with such clear, morning confidence, became obscured by a gathering veil of gray. A profound and unnatural gloom began to settle over the landscape, as if the very heavens were reflecting the dark turn of events on the earth below. Then, the first drops began to fall. They were not the gentle, life-giving rains of a summer shower, but cold, heavy drops that splattered against armor and soaked into woolen cloaks with a miserable finality. What began as a drizzle soon intensified into a relentless, driving torrent. This was no ordinary storm. It was a deluge of epic proportions, an unseasonable and violent weather front that seemed to have been summoned specifically for this moment. The sky, now a uniform sheet of bruised purple and gray, opened up and wept upon the legions. The wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that whipped through the ranks, tearing at standards and chilling the men to the bone. It drove the rain sideways in stinging sheets, blurring the world into a wash of gray and green. Visibility dropped to a few hundred feet. The proud, orderly column, once a symbol of imperial precision, began to lose its form, its cohesion dissolving under the meteorological assault. The ground beneath their feet, the very earth they marched upon, turned against them. The track that Arminius had recommended, which may have been a reasonably firm path in dry weather, transformed into a treacherous quagmire. It became a churning, sucking morass of mud that clung to their heavy, hobnailed sandals, the caligae, making every step a struggle. The mud pulled at their feet, stealing their energy, forcing them into a slow, exhausting trudge. For the legionaries, burdened with 60 to 80 pounds of armor, weapons, and personal gear, the march became a grueling ordeal. They slipped and slid, their disciplined ranks becoming ragged, disorganized files of weary men. The effect on the baggage train was even more catastrophic. The heavy, iron-rimmed wheels of the wagons, designed for paved Roman roads or firm, dry ground, sank deep into the mud. They became hopelessly bogged down, their axles groaning under the strain. The thousands of mules and oxen, their hooves finding no purchase in the slick, glutinous earth, strained against their harnesses, their panicked brays adding to the cacophony of the storm. Carts overturned, spilling their precious contents, grain, tools, personal belongings, into the muck. The long, snaking column began to concertina, with gaps opening up as the vanguard pushed forward while the rear became hopelessly mired. The 10-mile-long serpent was being chopped into pieces, not by an enemy blade, but by the mud and the rain. For the first few hours of the march, the sky held. But as the Roman column moved further from the open plains and closer to the brooding shadow of the forest, a change began to occur in the atmosphere. The air grew heavy, thick with a dampness that clung to the skin. The sun, which had shone with such clear, morning confidence, became obscured by a gathering veil of gray. A profound and unnatural gloom began to settle over the landscape, as if the very heavens were reflecting the dark turn of events on the earth below. Then, the first drops began to fall. They were not the gentle, life-giving rains of a summer shower, but cold, heavy drops that splattered against armor and soaked into woolen cloaks with a miserable finality. What began as a drizzle soon intensified into a relentless, driving torrent. This was no ordinary storm. It was a deluge of epic proportions, an unseasonable and violent weather front that seemed to have been summoned specifically for this moment. The sky, now a uniform sheet of bruised purple and gray, opened up and wept upon the legions. The wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that whipped through the ranks, tearing at standards and chilling the men to the bone. It drove the rain sideways in stinging sheets, blurring the world into a wash of gray and green. Visibility dropped to a few hundred feet. The proud, orderly column, once a symbol of imperial precision, began to lose its form, its cohesion dissolving under the meteorological assault. The ground beneath their feet, the very earth they marched upon, turned against them. The track that Arminius had recommended, which may have been a reasonably firm path in dry weather, transformed into a treacherous quagmire. It became a churning, sucking morass of mud that clung to their heavy, hobnailed sandals, the caligae, making every step a struggle. The mud pulled at their feet, stealing their energy, forcing them into a slow, exhausting trudge. For the legionaries, burdened with 60 to 80 pounds of armor, weapons, and personal gear, the march became a grueling ordeal. They slipped and slid, their disciplined ranks becoming ragged, disorganized files of weary men. The effect on the baggage train was even more catastrophic. The heavy, iron-rimmed wheels of the wagons, designed for paved Roman roads or firm, dry ground, sank deep into the mud. They became hopelessly bogged down, their axles groaning under the strain. The thousands of mules and oxen, their hooves finding no purchase in the slick, glutinous earth, strained against their harnesses, their panicked brays adding to the cacophony of the storm. Carts overturned, spilling their precious contents, grain, tools, personal belongings, into the muck. The long, snaking column began to concertina, with gaps opening up as the vanguard pushed forward while the rear became hopelessly mired. The 10-mile-long serpent was being chopped into pieces, not by an enemy blade, but by the mud and the rain. The psychological toll was immense. The cold seeped through their armor, a damp, persistent chill that no amount of marching could ward off. The ceaseless drumming of the rain on their helmets, the howl of the wind, and the rumble of thunder created a disorienting and oppressive soundscape. The world shrank to a miserable bubble of personal suffering. There was no grand vista of conquest, no sense of purpose, only the man in front of you, the mud beneath your feet, and the water running down your back. The legionaries, these conquerors of the world, were reduced to a primal struggle against the elements. Their advanced tactics, their superior discipline, their intricate battlefield formations, all were rendered meaningless. They were just cold, wet, and increasingly miserable men, a far cry from the confident soldiers who had set out that morning. Even their equipment began to betray them. The large, curved wooden shields, the scuta, became waterlogged, their weight increasing to an almost unbearable degree. The leather straps that held their armor together became slick and stretched. Their bowstrings, made of animal sinew, were soaked through, becoming slack and useless. The Romans were being systematically disarmed and demoralized by the weather itself. It was as if the gods of this land, the ancient spirits of the forest and the storm, had risen up in defense of their domain. The sky wept for the fate of the legions, or perhaps it wept in fury at their intrusion. This storm was the first phase of the German attack, an opening salvo delivered by nature itself. It isolated the Romans, exhausted them, and stripped them of their technological and tactical advantages, preparing them for the slaughter that was to come. Unseen, in the woods on either side of the track, the German warriors watched and waited, sheltered by the trees, their hearts filled with a cold, patient fury. The rain was their ally. The mud was their weapon. And the Romans, blinded and beleaguered, continued their slow. If the open plains under the weeping sky had been a place of misery, the forest was a place of primal dread. The moment the vanguard of the Roman column passed under the canopy of the first great trees of the Teutoburg, the world changed completely. It was an entry into another realm, a crossing of a threshold from the known world into something ancient, dark, and deeply hostile. The Teutoburg was not a managed woodland or a sparse collection of trees. It was a true primordial forest, a dense and tangled wilderness that had stood for centuries, untouched by Roman axes or engineering. It was a place of myth and legend for the Germanic tribes, a sacred and intimidating entity in its own right. For the Romans, it was simply the green hell. The trees were immense, oaks, beeches, and pines of a size rarely seen in the more civilized lands around the Mediterranean. Their massive trunks, slick with rain and draped in moss, rose like the columns of a monstrous, green-tinged cathedral. High above, their branches intertwined to form a thick, oppressive canopy that almost entirely blocked out the already gloomy sky. What little light penetrated the gloom was filtered into a sickly, greenish twilight that cast strange, dancing shadows on the forest floor. The transition was jarring. The roar of the wind and the drumming of the rain on their helmets were suddenly muffled, replaced by a new set of sounds. The constant, heavy dripping of water from a million leaves, the creak and groan of ancient boughs swaying in the wind, and the unnerving, almost total absorption of the sounds of their own march. The noise of 20,000 people was swallowed by the immense, damp silence of the woods. The path, which had been a muddy track in the open, now became a treacherous obstacle course. It narrowed significantly, forcing the legions to abandon any semblance of their wide marching formation. They were squeezed into a long, thin file, a single vulnerable artery pumping itself into the dark heart of the woods. The forest floor was a chaotic tangle of exposed roots, slick as ice, that threatened to snap an ankle with every step. Thorny bushes clawed at their cloaks and bare legs. Fallen trees, ancient giants that had crashed to the earth decades before, blocked the path, forcing the men to clamber over them or find a way around, further disrupting the integrity of the column. The air itself felt different. It was heavy, cold, and smelled of damp earth, rotting leaves, and a kind of ancient, vegetative decay. It was the smell of a world that was utterly indifferent to man. For the legionaries, this was a deeply unnerving environment. Roman military success was predicated on space, on clear lines of sight, on the ability to see the enemy and maneuver into their devastating formations. Here, their vision was limited to a few dozen feet in any direction. The dense, rain-soaked foliage on either side of the path was an impenetrable wall of green and black. An entire army could be hiding just 10 feet away, and they would never know it. Every shadow seemed to move, every rustle of leaves sounded like a footstep, every snap of a twig sent a jolt of adrenaline through the ranks. The forest was alive, and it was watching them. The psychological pressure was immense and unrelenting. It was a form of warfare they were completely unprepared for, a slow, grinding assault on the nerves. The men, already exhausted from their struggle with the mud and the rain, now felt a rising sense of claustrophobia and dread. They were trapped. The path behind them was a morass, and the path ahead led deeper into the same suffocating gloom. They were in a tunnel, a green tomb from which there was no easy escape. The eagle standards, the proud aquili that were supposed to be a source of inspiration, now seemed like a mockery. Their golden wings, which soared over open battlefields, were now hemmed in by the grasping branches, their majesty diminished by the oppressive darkness. The Romans were masters of an ordered, sunlit world of straight roads and fortified cities. This forest was the antithesis of everything they represented. It was a place of chaos, of nature untamed, a place where their rules and their disciplines seemed to have no meaning. This was the true genius of Arminius's plan. He had not chosen a battlefield. He had chosen a hunting ground. He knew that the forest itself would be his greatest ally. It would break the Roman spirit before a single sword was drawn. It would disorient them, exhaust them, and fill them with a primal fear that would erode their legendary discipline from the inside out. He was turning their own psychology against them. The Roman mind, so confident in its own superiority, was now confronted with an environment that it could not dominate, could not understand, and could not see. As the last of the baggage train, the final wagon with its terrified civilian occupants, disappeared under the shadow of the trees. At some point during that first, grueling day of the march, as the legions were fully committed to the treacherous path and the forest had closed in around them, a small detachment of horsemen separated itself from the main column. At their head rode Arminius, the Cheruscan prince, his face unreadable, a mask of calm and professional duty. He approached Quinctilius Varus, who was likely struggling near the front of the column, his mood as dark as the storm-laden sky. The moment of final deception had arrived. It was a quiet, almost perfunctory exchange, yet it was the most significant act of the entire campaign, the turning of the key in the lock of the trap. Arminius reined in his horse beside the governor, the animal steaming in the cold, damp air. He would have spoken in his flawless, reassuring Latin. The time had come, he explained, for him and his auxiliary cavalry to fulfill their part of the plan. The main Roman force was now well on its way, and he needed to ride ahead to secure the route, and more importantly, to rally loyal tribes to the Roman cause. He was painting a picture of a coordinated military operation. While Varus and the legions provided the heavy hammer, he and his German horsemen would act as the swift-moving scouts and allies, gathering friendly forces to help crush the supposed rebellion. He was reinforcing the illusion that they were all on the same side, working towards a common goal. Varus, soaked, frustrated, And mired in the logistical nightmare of the march, Arminius's words must have been a welcome sound. It was a sign of progress, a confirmation that the plan was proceeding as it should. Here was his trusted friend and subordinate, taking the initiative, acting with the decisiveness of a true Roman commander. He would have seen no reason to doubt him. The entire premise of this disastrous detour was built upon the foundation of Arminius's loyalty. To question him now would be to admit that the entire endeavor was a catastrophic mistake, and Varus's pride would not allow for that. He needed to believe in Arminius, because the alternative was unthinkable, so the governor gave his assent. He would have watched as Arminius wheeled his horse around, gave a crisp command to his troopers, and led them away from the main column. They didn't charge off into the woods, that would have been too suspicious. They likely continued along the path for a short distance before peeling off onto a smaller, almost invisible side trail, disappearing with practiced ease into the dense, dripping foliage. The sight of them leaving was, for the Romans, a sign of hope. It meant that help was on its way, that the situation was being managed. It was the last positive sign they would ever see. This was the moment of absolute betrayal. It was not a heated, emotional act of defiance, but a cold, calculated, and silent one. As Arminius and his men vanished into the trees, they were not riding to rally allies for Rome. They were riding to join the thousands of German warriors who were already lying in wait. They were moving to take up their own positions in the ambush they had so meticulously planned. Arminius's departure was the final signal. It meant the legions were now fully ensnared, stretched out and vulnerable along the narrow path. They were deep in the forest, exhausted by the storm, and most importantly, they were now completely alone. They had been stripped of their cavalry screen, the fast-moving eyes and ears that any Roman army relied upon for reconnaissance and protection against surprise attacks. The last time Quinctilius Varus saw the face of the man he considered his friend, it was the face of a loyal officer heading off to do his duty. He did not see the triumphant, cold fury that must have been burning behind Arminius's eyes. He did not understand that he had just shaken hands with his own executioner. The departure was quiet, professional, and utterly chilling in its duplicity. For Arminius, this was the point of no return. He had shed the skin of the Roman knight for the last time. As he melted into the German wilderness, he was no longer Arminius, the Ekes of Rome. He was now fully and finally the son of Segemur, the avenging prince of the Cherusei, the commander of a great host poised to deliver a death blow to the empire that had both educated and humiliated him. For the legions left behind, his absence would soon be felt, not as a lack of support, but as the prelude to a deafening, terrifying, and all-consuming storm of violence. The shepherd had left the flock, and the wolves were closing in. For a time after Arminius's departure, the miserable routine of the march continued. There was only the squelch of sandals in the mud, the rhythmic creak of leather, the heavy breathing of exhausted men, and the ceaseless, dripping dampness of the forest. The sense of dread was a palpable, physical thing, a cold weight in the pit of every soldier's stomach. The men's eyes darted nervously towards the impenetrable walls of trees on either side of the path. They were soldiers trained for the open field, for the clear geometry of battle. This place felt wrong, a perversion of warfare, a place where all their strengths were nullified. They were blind, deaf, and drowning in a sea of green. Then, it happened. It was not a thunderous charge or a terrifying war cry, not at first. It was a single, simple sound that cut through the gloom with chilling precision. A high-pitched, menacing whistle. It was the sound of a projectile moving through the air at great speed, a sound every soldier knew and feared. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. Heads snapped up. Eyes widened in alarm. And then, with a sickening thud, the sound found its target. Perhaps it was a legionary in the vanguard, a man who had been staring into the oppressive woods, trying to pierce the shadows. Perhaps it was a centurion, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword, his face a mask of grim determination. Or perhaps, in a moment of supreme and terrible irony, it struck one of the eagle-bearers, the aquilifer, the man carrying the sacred symbol of the legion's soul. The man cried out, a sharp, strangled gasp of shock and pain, and staggered. A long, dark-fletched arrow was protruding from his chest or throat, a fatal bloom of wood and steel. He fell heavily into the mud, his armor clattering, his lifeblood staining the wet earth a darker shade of brown. The silence that followed his fall was more terrifying than the sound that preceded it. It was a moment of collective, heart-stopping realization. The vague, formless dread that had haunted them for miles had just been given a sharp and deadly form. They were not alone. The forest was not just watching them, it was actively trying to kill them. Panic, the most feared enemy of any army, flared like a torch in the Roman ranks. The men nearest the fallen soldiers scrambled back, their discipline momentarily forgotten. Shouts of alarm echoed down the long, fragmented column. Hosts! Hosts! Enemies! The cry was picked up and repeated, a wave of fear traveling faster than any runner. Men fumbled for their weapons, their hands slick with rain and sweat. They tried to form a defensive line, to raise their heavy, waterlogged shields and present a wall of steel to the unseen foe. But how do you form a line against an enemy you cannot see? Which way do you face when the threat is everywhere and nowhere at once? The forest remained silent. There was no charge, no follow-up volley. There was only the single, fallen Roman, a testament to the deadly accuracy of the hidden foe. This was not a random shot. It was a signal. It was a deliberate, psychological blow designed to shatter the Romans' already frayed nerves and announce the beginning of the slaughter. It was Arminius, the master tactician, telling them, I am here. You are surrounded. You are going to die. The first arrow was more than just a weapon. It was a message. It transformed the grueling march into a battle for survival. It marked the precise moment when the Roman legions, the conquerors of the world, ceased to be the hunters and became, unequivocally, the hunted. The officers, the centurions and tribunes, raced to restore order. Their voices, raw and urgent, cut through the rising panic. Form up. Ad signa. To the standards. They struck the flat of their swords against the shields of wavering men, their training and discipline fighting against the primal urge to break and run. Slowly, shakily, the legionaries began to respond. They formed a makeshift shield wall, a defensive tortoise, or testudo, facing outwards into the silent, menacing trees. They peered into the gloom, their knuckles white on their sword hilts, their hearts pounding against their ribs. They were ready for a fight. But the enemy did not give them the fight they wanted. The Germans remained hidden, patient, masters of this terrain. The first arrow had been the overture. The main symphony of violence was about to begin. And it would come not from one direction, but from all of them. The relentless barrage from the rampart was only the beginning. It was the anvil. Now, the hammer was about to fall. As the Roman column reeled in shock and confusion, their ranks shredded by the storm of missiles, Arminius gave the second signal. From the dense, concealing woods on the opposite side of the track, and from hidden gaps left in the rampart itself, the German warriors swarmed forth. They did not advance in ordered lines like the legions, but as a terrifying, fluid tide of humanity, pouring down the slopes and crashing into the vulnerable flank of the Roman column. The legionaries, who had been cowering under their shields from the vertical assault, were now faced with a horizontal one. They had to break their defensive testudo formation to turn and face this new, immediate threat. The moment they did, they exposed themselves once more to the deadly rain of spears and stones from the rampart above. They were caught in a perfectly designed crossfire, a tactical nightmare from which there was no escape. The choice was to be crushed from above or to be hacked apart from the side. Most faced both at once. The disciplined Roman line, the bedrock of its military supremacy for centuries, shattered into 1,000 desperate, individual struggles for survival. The German warriors were a fearsome sight, a stark contrast to the uniformed legionaries. They were huge men, many fighting with their chests bare, their bodies covered in tattoos and war paint. Their long hair flew wildly as they charged, their faces contorted in a frenzy of battle lust. They wielded not the short, practical gladius of the Romans, but long, heavy slashing swords, massive wooden clubs studded with iron, and the deadly, versatile framea spear, which they used for both throwing and for close quarters thrusting. They were fighting on their home ground, in a forest where they had hunted and trained their entire lives. They moved with a terrifying agility and confidence, leaping over fallen logs and using trees for cover, while the Romans slipped and struggled in the thick, cloying mud. The very nature of the combat was alien to the legionaries. They were trained for the tight, disciplined press of the shield wall, where each man protected his neighbor and they advanced as a single, unstoppable unit. Here, that cohesion was gone. The battle devolved into a chaotic series of duels and small-scale melees amidst the trees and the mud. A Roman soldier would find himself isolated, surrounded by 3 or 4 screaming tribesmen. His short gladius, so deadly in the crush of a battle line, was at a disadvantage against the longer reach of the German swords and spears. His heavy shield, already waterlogged and cumbersome, became a liability in the tangled undergrowth. The sounds of the battle were a symphony of horror. The sharp, metallic ring of a gladius parrying a heavy sword, the wet, sickening crunch of an axe biting into a helmet, the splintering of a shield, and the endless, desperate screams of the wounded and the dying. The Germans, fighting with the fury of men reclaiming their homeland, gave no quarter. They were not trying to take prisoners, they were trying to annihilate. They swarmed over the Romans, their sheer ferocity and the element of surprise overwhelming the superior training and armor of the legionaries. The column, that great serpent of Roman power, was being hacked to pieces. It was no longer a single entity, but a series of isolated pockets of resistance, each one surrounded and being systematically destroyed. A century of men would try to form a defensive circle, a hedgehog of spears and shields, only to be overwhelmed by the sheer weight of numbers. Officers trying to rally their men were specifically targeted, cut down by javelins or swarmed by warriors who recognized their ornate helmets and armor. With their leaders gone, the pockets of resistance dissolved into panicked mobs. The battle had lost all form. It was no longer a contest between 2 armies, it was a slaughter. The forest floor, already a river of mud, now began to run with blood, the rain washing it in crimson streams around the bodies of the fallen. The great column was broken, its back snapped, its head and tail severed. All that was left were the death throes. While the veteran legionaries at the head and middle of the column were locked in a desperate, hopeless struggle for their lives, a different kind of horror was unfolding at the rear. Here was the baggage train, the long, vulnerable tail of the Roman serpent. It was a world away from the disciplined cohorts, a chaotic jumble of wagons, pack animals, and, most tragically, people. This was where the non-combatants were, the civilians who had for years lived under the protection of the legions. There were the wives of the soldiers, women who had followed their husbands to this remote frontier. There were their children, born in the shadow of the standards, Roman citizens who knew no home but the camps of Germania. There were merchants, servants, scribes, and artisans, the entire support structure of a provincial government on the move. They were already in a state of terror. The sounds of the battle, the distant war cries, the screams, the clash of steel, would have reached them as a terrifying, incomprehensible wave of noise rolling back through the forest. They were trapped, their wagons hopelessly mired in the mud, their progress stalled long before the first German warrior appeared. They were a captive audience to the slaughter of their protectors. Then the Germans were upon them. Specialized contingents of warriors, who had let the main body of the legions pass, now emerged from the woods to fall upon this soft, undefended target. What happened here was not a battle, it was a massacre. The few soldiers assigned to guard the baggage train were swiftly overwhelmed, cut down in a furious, one-sided rush. After that, there was no one left to offer any meaningful resistance. The German warriors, their blood up from the fighting, swarmed through the chaotic maze of wagons and terrified animals. Their fury was not just directed at the soldiers who had occupied their land, but at the entire Roman presence, at the symbols of the civilization that sought to supplant their own. They fell upon the civilians with pitiless brutality. The scene defied imagination. Men were dragged from their carts and cut down. Servants and scribes, who had never held a sword in their lives, were slaughtered where they stood. The warriors tore into the wagons, not just for plunder, but in a frenzy of destruction. Crates of supplies were smashed open, their contents strewn across the muddy ground. Amphorae of wine were shattered, the red liquid mixing with the rain and the blood. Chests of official documents and tax records were ripped apart, the parchments trampled into the muck, a symbolic destruction of the very bureaucracy that had been imposed upon them. But the greatest horror was reserved for the families. The screams of women and children echoed through the dark woods, a sound of pure, unmitigated terror. There was no sanctuary, no mercy. The bonds of family, which the Romans held as sacred, were violently torn asunder. Children were ripped from their mothers' arms. Wives witnessed the slaughter of their husbands before they too were cut down. For the Germans, these were not innocent non-combatants. They were invaders, the seeds of a foreign people attempting to take root in their soil. The annihilation had to be total. Every trace of the Roman presence had to be erased with blood. The plunder was secondary to the destruction. While some warriors grabbed coins or valuable items, the primary impulse was one of violent rejection. They were not just defeating an army, they were cleansing their land. The baggage train, with its civilian population and its administrative baggage, was the most potent symbol of Roman colonization. Its utter destruction was a vital part of the uprising's psychological and political goals. It was a brutal, terrifying message to Rome. This land is not yours. Your laws, your families, your very presence will not be tolerated here. As the rain continued to fall, it washed over a scene of unimaginable carnage, a tableau of overturned wagons, slaughtered animals, and the still, silent bodies of those whose only crime was to be Roman in a place that had violently, and finally, rejected everything that name represented. As the last of the gray, failing light bled from the sky, the sounds of battle began to subside. The Germans, their initial fury spent, did not press the attack into the full darkness. They were masters of this forest, and they knew that a chaotic night battle could be as dangerous for them as for the Romans. They withdrew, melting back into the shadows of the trees from which they had emerged, leaving the Romans to the horrors of the night. What was left of the 3 legions was not an army, but a shattered, bleeding remnant, a collection of survivors huddled together in the mud and the dark. Somehow, through the heroic efforts of the remaining centurions and the sheer, desperate will of the men, they had managed to form a defensive perimeter. It was not the clean, fortified rectangle of a proper Roman marching camp. There was no time and no energy for that. Instead, they had used the wreckage of their own baggage wagons, the bodies of their fallen comrades, and hastily felled trees to create a crude, circular barricade in a small clearing. It was a pathetic imitation of Roman military order, a desperate attempt to impose some form of control on a situation that had spiraled into pure chaos. Inside this circle of despair lay the survivors of the first day's slaughter. The night that descended upon them was a new kind of hell, a psychological torment that was in many ways worse than the physical violence of the day. The darkness was absolute, a thick, suffocating blackness broken only by the weak, sputtering light of a few hastily built campfires. These fires, fed with damp wood, gave off more smoke than light, their flickering glow casting long, dancing shadows that played tricks on the exhausted minds of the sentries. Every shape in the darkness became a lurking warrior, every gust of wind through the trees a prelude to another attack. The air was filled with a symphony of human suffering. From all around the makeshift camp, in the no-man's land between the Roman barricade and the forest's edge, came the agonizing groans and pleas of the wounded. These were men who had been cut down but not killed, left to die slowly in the cold and the mud. Their comrades within the camp could hear them, could sometimes even recognize their voices, calling out for water, for their mothers, for death. But to attempt a rescue was suicide. The Germans were out there, in the darkness, and any man who ventured beyond the barricade would be met with a swift and silent end. The legionaries were forced to listen to the death throes of their friends, a form of torture that gnawed at their souls, and from further out, from the depths of the forest, came other sounds. The triumphant, guttural howls of the German warriors. They were celebrating their victory, their voices rising and falling in wild, intimidating chants. The Romans could hear their laughter, the sounds of a people reveling in the destruction of their enemies. It was a constant, terrifying reminder of their utter defeat and their hopeless situation. They were surrounded, besieged by a victorious enemy, with no hope of reinforcement and no chance of escape. Within the camp, the scene was grim. The surgeons, their supplies mostly lost in the baggage train massacre, did what they could. They moved through the huddled masses of men, their hands and clothes stained with blood, trying to bind wounds with torn strips of cloak, offering what little comfort they could. But for most of the severely wounded, there was no hope. Varus himself was among them. He had survived the first day, but he was a broken man. He was wounded not just in body, but in spirit. The full weight of his catastrophic misjudgment had crashed down upon him. He saw the faces of the men who were dying because of his arrogance, because of his blind trust in a man who had played him for a fool. The historian Tacitus would later write of the scene: the ground swampy, the bodies of men and beasts piled together, the ghastly skulls of Romans nailed to the trees. This was the reality Varus now inhabited, a nightmare of his own making. Sleep was impossible. There was only the cold, the rain, the moans of the dying, and the terrifying sounds from the darkness beyond. The night offered no rest, only a long, slow, agonizing wait for the dawn, which they all knew would bring nothing but more death. The dawn of the second day arrived not as a symbol of hope, but as a gray, merciless light that revealed the full extent of the previous day's carnage. The makeshift camp was a charnel house, the ground littered with the dead and the dying. For the survivors, there was no time for grief, no time for proper burials. There was only one desperate imperative: to move. To stay in this place was to be encircled and slowly starved into submission or annihilated in a final, hopeless stand. Their only chance, however slim, was to break out, to try and reach the safety of the fortress at Aliso, still many agonizing miles to the west. The order was given to abandon what was left of their supplies. The remaining wagons were set ablaze, a plume of thick, black smoke rising into the gray sky. A funeral pyre for the legion's pride and a desperate attempt to deny the enemy any further plunder. They burned the bodies of their comrades where they could, a hasty, inadequate rite for men who deserved so much more. The severely wounded, those who could not walk, were left to their fate. It was a brutal, heart-wrenching decision, a violation of the Roman military ethos of leaving no man behind. But it was a grim necessity. In this struggle for survival, there was no room for sentiment, only the cold calculus of who could still march and who could still fight. The column that formed up that morning was a pathetic shadow of the mighty force that had entered the forest. It was smaller, ragged, and moved with the shuffling, exhausted gait of doomed men. Their armor was dented and blood-stained, their shields splintered. Their faces were gaunt, etched with the horror of what they had seen and the sleepless terror of the night. They were no longer marching with the confident stride of conquerors, but with the grim, forward-lurching momentum of men fleeing a nightmare. They left their circle of despair and plunged back into the green hell of the forest. The Germans were waiting for them. They did not allow the Romans to march unmolested. The second day was not a repeat of the first day's massive, set-piece ambush. Instead, it became a running battle of attrition, a long, drawn-out agony that stretched for miles. The Germans had abandoned their large rampart and now employed guerrilla tactics, at which they were masters. They harried the Roman column from all sides, darting out from behind trees to hurl javelins or launch swift, brutal attacks on the flanks and the rear, only to melt back into the woods before the legionaries could mount an effective response. The terrain, if anything, grew worse. The Romans now found themselves in more open country within the forest, which seemed at first like a blessing. But this was another of Arminius's traps. The open ground was marshy and bog-like, a treacherous swamp that was even more difficult to traverse than the muddy track of the previous day. The men sank to their knees in the cold, stagnant water, their movements slow and clumsy. This was where the German warriors, lighter on their feet and knowing the safe paths, had the supreme advantage. They could strike and fade with impunity, while the heavily armored Romans were easy, slow-moving targets. The march became a series of frantic, chaotic skirmishes. A volley of spears would fly out of the trees, felling a handful of men. The column would halt, trying to form a defensive posture, only for another attack to come from the opposite direction. It was a death by 1,000 cuts. The legionaries were being bled white, their numbers constantly dwindling, their energy sapped by the endless fighting and the struggle to move through the bog. The psychological strain was immense. The enemy was a phantom, a ghost in the trees, rarely seen but always felt. The Romans were like a great, wounded beast being tormented by a swarm of hornets, unable to land a decisive blow, slowly being stung to death. They fought with the courage of desperation. Small groups of legionaries would launch furious, suicidal charges into the woods, trying to engage the enemy, only to be surrounded and cut down. The centurions, the backbone of the army, were magnificent in their courage, constantly moving along the line, plugging gaps, encouraging their men, and fighting with a ferocity born of rage and despair. But they too were falling one by one. With every officer lost, the column became more disorganized, more vulnerable. The second day was a slow, grinding descent into oblivion. There was no grand strategy, no hope of victory, only the primal, animal instinct to keep moving, to keep fighting, to take one more step, and to survive for one more hour in the face of certain death. In the heart of every Roman legionary, there was a sacred space reserved for one thing: the Aquila, the eagle. It was not merely a standard, not just a metal effigy on a pole. It was the soul of the legion, the physical embodiment of its honor, its history, and its divine connection to Rome and the god Jupiter himself. The man who carried it, the Aquilifer, was chosen for his unwavering courage and strength, for his duty was the most sacred in the entire army, to protect the eagle with his life. To lose an eagle in battle was the ultimate disgrace, a stain so profound that it could lead to the disbandment of an entire legion. It was a defeat that transcended the physical loss of men. It was a spiritual death. On that second horrific day of the march, this ultimate shame was visited upon the dying legions of Varus. Amidst the chaos of the running battle, in the treacherous, marshy ground, a section of the Roman line faltered. Exhausted, wounded, and demoralized, the men were struggling to maintain their footing and fend off the relentless guerrilla attacks. The Germans, sensing a moment of weakness, coordinated a sudden, ferocious charge. It was not a random skirmish. This was a targeted assault, led by a chieftain who knew exactly what he was looking for. A wave of warriors, screaming their terrifying war cries, burst from the treeline and crashed into the weakened Roman flank with unstoppable momentum. The Roman line buckled and then broke. The legionaries, caught off balance in the boggy terrain, were thrown back. In the heart of this melee was the Aquilifer of the 18th Legion. He would have been a towering figure, perhaps wearing a lion or bearskin over his helmet, his powerful hands gripping the staff of the sacred standard. He was the rallying point, the symbol of defiance. As the line around him collapsed, he became an island in a sea of enemies. He would have fought with the fury of a cornered lion, using the heavy base of the standard as a weapon, swinging it to crush the skulls of his attackers, his other hand wielding his gladius. But he was alone, and he was surrounded. The German warriors swarmed him, their long swords and spears reaching past his defenses. They were not just trying to kill him, they were trying to seize his burden. A spear thrust found its mark. A sword slash cut through his arm. He staggered, his lifeblood pouring into the marshy water, but his grip on the eagle remained firm, even as his strength failed him. He fell to his knees, his last act on earth an attempt to drive the base of the standard into the ground, to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. But it was too late. A German warrior, perhaps the chieftain himself, tore the eagle from his dying grasp. A great, triumphant roar erupted from the German ranks, a sound that cut through the din of battle and struck a dagger of ice into the heart of every Roman who heard it. The warrior held the eagle aloft, its golden wings, the symbol of Roman invincibility, now a trophy in the hands of a barbarian. He paraded it before the horrified eyes of the legionaries, a gesture of ultimate contempt and absolute victory. For the men of the 18th Legion, the sight was soul-destroying. It was as if their very spirit had been ripped from their bodies. The will to fight drained away, replaced by a profound, crushing despair. What was the point of fighting on when their honor was already lost, their soul captured? The loss of the first eagle sent a shockwave of horror through what remained of the Roman column. It was a tangible sign that the gods had abandoned them, that their cause was utterly and irrevocably lost. The news would have spread quickly. a whispered message of doom passing from man to man. The eagle is taken. The 18th has lost its eagle. Soon after, in another part of the battlefield, another desperate struggle, another heroic last stand, and another eagle, perhaps that of the 17th or 19th, was also captured. The Germans were specifically hunting them, guided by Arminius, who knew their supreme symbolic importance. The loss of one eagle was a catastrophe. The loss of two or more was an event without precedent, an unimaginable humiliation for the Roman army. The battle was no longer about survival, it was about the desecration of Rome itself. Somewhere in the heart of the dying column, surrounded by a dwindling knot of his personal bodyguards and senior officers, was Publius Quinctilius Varus. The man who had entered this forest as a confident proconsul, an extension of the emperor's will, was now reduced to a mere spectator of his own colossal failure. He was wounded, perhaps from a spear thrust or a thrown stone, a physical pain that was nothing compared to the torment consuming his soul. Every scream he heard, every fallen soldier he saw, was a fresh indictment of his own folly. The grand edifice of his career, his reputation, his very identity, had crumbled to dust and ashes in the space of 48 hours. He would have looked around him and seen not an army, but a Boschian painting of hell brought to life. He saw the faces of his men, faces that were once clean-shaven and disciplined, now caked in mud and blood, their eyes wide with the terror he had led them into. He saw the splintered shields, the broken formations, the utter chaos where once there had been perfect Roman order. This was his command, his responsibility. The weight of 20,000 lives, the men, the women, the children, all rested squarely on his shoulders. He had marched them into this trap, and he had done so with a smug self-assurance that now seemed like a form of madness. The ultimate blow, the news that shattered the last vestiges of his composure, was the loss of the eagles. When the message reached him, whispered by a breathless and blood-stained tribune, that the eagle of the 18th had been taken, it was a sentence of death for his spirit. Then came the news of the second. These were not just any legions, these were his legions, entrusted to his care by the emperor himself. Their honor was his honor, their disgrace his disgrace. To lose one eagle was a career-ending failure. To lose two, perhaps even three, was a historical infamy. His name, the name of Quinctilius Varus, would not just be recorded in the annals of Rome as a failure, it would be a curse, a byword for incompetence and disaster for centuries to come. In that moment, the full, horrific clarity of his situation must have descended upon him. He finally saw the truth, stripped of all its comforting illusions. He saw Arminius not as the charming, Romanized friend, but as the master architect of his ruin, a man whose hatred he had been too arrogant and too blind to see. He replayed every conversation, every shared meal, every piece of reassuring advice, and saw it for what it was, a step-by-step seduction into oblivion. He remembered the warnings of Segestes, the pleas of his own uncle-in-law, which he had dismissed with such casual contempt. The truth had been laid bare before him, and he had refused to see it. His hubris had been a shield, protecting him from reality, and now that shield was gone, leaving his soul exposed to the full, agonizing force of his failure, he was a Roman patrician. He belonged to a class and a culture that valued honor above life itself. For a man like Varus, there were fates far worse than death. Capture was one. To be paraded through the German villages as a trophy, to be humiliated and tortured by the barbarians he had held in such disdain, was an unthinkable prospect. But even worse than capture was the thought of surviving to face Rome. To return to the city, to stand before Augustus and explain how he had lost 3 legions, their eagles, and a Roman province through his own negligence, that was a fate beyond endurance. There would be no forgiveness, only eternal shame. His despair was absolute. It was the despair of a man who has lost everything: his army, his honor, his future, and his past. He looked at the hopeless battle raging around him, at the faces of the few loyal men still fighting to protect him, and he knew there was only one path left. It was the Roman way out, the final, stoic act of a nobleman who has been utterly defeated by fortune. He could not undo his failure, but he could escape its final humiliations. The decision formed in his mind, cold and hard as a piece of iron. He would not let the Germans have him. He would not let Rome judge him. He would be the final arbiter of his own fate. By the third day, the concept of a march was a distant memory. There was no longer any hope of reaching the fortress at Aliso. The goal of survival had been whittled down to its most primal, minute-by-minute form. What was left of the 3 Roman legions, a few thousand men at most, a mere fraction of the proud host that had entered the woods, was finally brought to bay. The Germans, relentless in their pursuit, had herded the survivors into a final, inescapable killing ground. It may have been a small, wooded hill, or a clearing surrounded by thick forest, a place later known to the Romans as the Saltus Teutoburgiensis. Here, with their backs to the wall and no path of retreat, the last of the legionaries turned to face their doom. This was no longer a running battle or a chaotic skirmish. This was a final stand. All pretense of formation was gone, save for what could be managed by instinct and raw courage. The survivors, a grim collection of wounded, exhausted and blood-soaked men, gathered together for one last act of defiance. They formed a rough circle, a hedgehog of battered shields and dulled swords, standing shoulder to shoulder over the bodies of their fallen comrades. The ground beneath their feet was a churned-up soup of mud and blood, littered with broken weapons and discarded equipment. The air was thick with the stench of death and the palpable electricity of impending annihilation. The men who stood in that circle were the toughest, the luckiest, and the most stubborn of the legions. They were the hardened veterans, the centurions who had survived against all odds, the legionaries who had refused to break. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and physically spent, but in their eyes, a last, defiant fire still burned. They were Roman soldiers. They had conquered the world, and if they were to die here, in this forsaken forest, they would die as Roman soldiers, on their feet and with their swords in their hands. The Germans, sensing the end was near, gathered for the final assault. They did not rush in wildly. They surrounded the Roman position, their numbers a dense, dark sea of warriors lapping at the shores of the small island of Roman resistance. The war cries started again, a deafening chorus of victory and hate that echoed through the trees. Then, the final attack began. From all sides at once, the German warriors charged, a human wave crashing down upon the beleaguered survivors. What followed was the epitome of close-quarters combat, a brutal, hacking, and stabbing melee of unimaginable ferocity. The Romans fought with the strength of men with nothing left to lose. Their gladii, the short swords designed for this very kind of work, rose and fell in deadly, efficient arcs. They stabbed from behind the wall of their shields, their movements economical and lethal, honed by years of training. For every Roman that fell, he took a German with him. The centurions were at the forefront, their crested helmets a beacon in the chaos, their voices roaring encouragement to their men, their swords a blur of motion. They were fighting for their lives, but also for their honor, for the memory of their lost eagles, and for the pride of Rome itself. But courage alone could not hold back the tide. The German numbers were simply overwhelming. The Roman circle, under pressure from all sides, began to shrink. Warriors clambered over the bodies of the fallen to get at the men still standing. The shield wall, already fragmented, began to collapse entirely. A Roman would be pulled down, and 2 or 3 Germans would immediately leap into the gap. The fighting was hand-to-hand, eye-to-eye. It was a maelstrom of violence, a vortex of desperation and fury that consumed everything. The final stand of the 17th, 18th, and 19th legions was not a clean or glorious affair. It was a desperate, bloody, and ultimately futile struggle in the mud, a last, defiant roar before the inevitable silence. With the suicide of Varus and his officers, and the collapse of the last organized pockets of resistance, the battle, as a contest between 2 opposing forces, was over. What followed was the final, grim chapter of the story, the annihilation. The German warriors, their victory now absolute, swarmed over the last Roman positions. For the few legionaries still standing, wounded and exhausted, there was no longer any question of fighting back. There was only the terrifying, final moment of recognition as a long-haired, screaming warrior descended upon them that no quarter was given. This was not a battle in the Roman tradition, where prisoners were often taken to be sold as slaves or ransomed for profit. This was a war of extermination. Arminius and the chieftains had stoked the fires of hatred for years, and now that hatred was unleashed in its most primal and brutal form. The goal was not just to defeat the legions, but to erase them from the face of the earth, to ensure that not a single soldier would escape to tell the tale. The remaining survivors were hunted down and slaughtered mercilessly. They were cut down where they stood, speared as they tried to flee, or clubbed to death as they begged for their lives. The forest floor, already a nightmarish landscape of death, became a butcher's yard. The Germans moved through the piles of bodies, their earlier battle frenzy replaced by a cold, methodical process of killing. They dispatched the wounded with a spear thrust or a sword stroke, their cries for mercy ignored. The sounds of combat faded, replaced by the wet, sickening sounds of the slaughter. The air grew thick with the metallic scent of blood, a smell so strong it would cling to this place for years to come. The numbers were almost incomprehensible. In the space of 3 days, 3 entire Roman legions, along with their auxiliary cohorts and a vast civilian following, had ceased to exist. Over 20,000 people, soldiers, women, children, were killed. A handful may have escaped in the initial chaos, slipping away into the woods to begin a desperate, lonely flight back towards the Rhine, but the vast majority perished here, in the dark, wet forests of Germania. An entire army, representing more than 1/10 of the Roman Empire's total military strength, had been wiped out. The aftermath was a scene of grim, silent work. The Germans, their bloodlust sated, began the process of claiming the spoils. They moved among the dead, stripping the valuable, high-quality Roman armor from the bodies. The segmented plates of the Larica segmentata, the ornate helmets of the centurions, the sharp, well-crafted gladii, all were taken as trophies of this monumental victory. The bodies of the Romans were left naked and exposed to the elements, a final act of dishonor. But the fate of some of the high-ranking officers who were taken alive before they could commit suicide was even more horrific. They were not granted a quick death. They were saved for a more symbolic purpose. They were bound and dragged away to the sacred groves of the Germanic tribes. There, in dark, terrifying rituals, they were sacrificed to the gods of war. Some were hanged from the branches of trees. Others were bled out over altars. Some were even boiled alive in great cauldrons. These were acts of religious fury, a thanksgiving to the gods who they believed had granted them this impossible victory, and a terrifying warning to the empire that had dared to violate their sacred lands. The annihilation was complete. It was physical, spiritual, and total. The forest fell silent, its floor now a carpet of the dead, a permanent and ghastly monument to Rome's darkest hour. In the days following the final slaughter, the Teutoburg Forest was no longer a battlefield, but a vast, open-air tomb, a monument to a victory so total it bordered on the divine for the Germanic tribes. The architect of this victory, Arminius, now walked through the scenes of his masterpiece. This was not a walk of remorse or reflection, but of grim, triumphant consolidation. He moved through the clearings, past the piles of naked, bloating Roman corpses, his face a hard mask of fulfilled vengeance. He had done the impossible. He had united the perpetually feuding tribes, lured the invincible legions into a trap of his own design, and utterly annihilated them. He was now the undisputed hero of Germania, the great liberator. But the victory needed to be sealed, not just in blood, but in a language of terror that Rome would understand across the hundreds of miles that separated this forest from the imperial capital. The work of desecration began. Under Arminius's orders, the bodies of the common soldiers were largely left where they fell, to be consumed by the wolves and the crows, a final insult to the Roman belief in the sanctity of burial. But for the officers, the centurions and tribunes, a more gruesome fate was reserved. Their heads were severed from their bodies. These were not just random acts of brutality, they were calculated political statements. The severed heads were treated as trophies of war. Some were sent as gifts to other Germanic tribes, like the powerful Marcomanni under their king Maroboduus, as both an invitation to join the great uprising and a stark demonstration of Arminius's power. It was a call to arms, written in blood and bone. But the majority of the heads were kept for a more visceral and immediate purpose. They were brought to the site of the final battle, and there, they were nailed to the trunks of the great, silent trees. The forest was transformed into a grotesque and terrifying gallery of the dead. The faces of Rome's finest officers, their features frozen in a final rictus of agony or defiance, stared out from the bark of the ancient oaks. It was a warning, a boundary marker drawn with human remains, declaring this land to be forever German, a place where Roman ambition came to die. The sacred eagles, the captured souls of the legions, were likely displayed in the most sacred groves, trophies offered up to the Germanic gods of war, a symbol of their divine favor and Rome's impotence. The most symbolic act of all concerned the body of Quinctilius Varus himself. The Germans found his body where he had fallen on his sword. While many of his officers were decapitated, Arminius, in a final, complex gesture, ordered the governor's body to be burned on a pyre. It was a seeming act of respect, a nod to the Roman custom of cremation. But it was also a final assertion of his power. He, Arminius, would grant the Roman governor the rights that his own men were denied. After the cremation, he gathered the charred remains of Varus's head and, instead of nailing it to a tree, he had it carefully preserved. He would send this, the last remnant of the man who called him friend, as a personal message to his other great rival, King Marebaduus, and eventually, it would find its way back to Rome. The aftermath was a period of grim, triumphant consolidation. The captured Roman forts and outposts east of the Rhine, now isolated and without hope of relief, were overrun one by one. The fortress at Aliso, the intended winter quarters for Varus's legions, mounted a heroic defense and a portion of its garrison managed a miraculous breakout, but most others fell. The entire Roman infrastructure in Germania, the product of 20 years of slow, hard-won conquest, was wiped out in a matter of weeks. The land was, for the moment, cleansed. Arminius stood as the undisputed victor, the man who had stared into the eyes of the world's greatest superpower and made it blink. But his victory, born in such spectacular carnage, had also sown the seeds of a terrible and vengeful Roman response. The echoes of the screams from the Teutoburg Forest were just beginning their long journey towards the ears of the emperor. For weeks after the annihilation, a profound and unnatural silence fell over the Roman frontier. The regular patrols, the couriers carrying messages, the merchants traveling under military escort, all the normal traffic that flowed between the heart of the empire and its newest province simply ceased. At the great legionary fortresses along the Rhine, commanders would have stared east into the vast, dark forests of Germania and wondered. The lack of news was, in itself, news of the most alarming kind. A feeling of deep unease began to permeate the garrisons, a sense of a great, unspoken catastrophe. Then, the first survivors began to appear. They were not a returning army, but lone, terrified specters stumbling out of the wilderness. They were gaunt, half-starved, their clothes in tatters, their eyes hollowed out by the horrors they had witnessed. Some were legionaries who had been wounded early and left for dead, only to awaken and begin a desperate, solitary trek through hostile territory. Others were from the garrison of Aliso, men who had broken out and fought their way back to the Rhine. They were barely coherent, their stories a feverish, fragmented nightmare of endless rain, suffocating forests, and a relentless, unseen enemy first, their tales may have been met with disbelief. The complete loss of 3 legions? It was unthinkable, a scenario so catastrophic as to be beyond the realm of possibility. It was easier to believe these were madmen, their minds broken by the strain of frontier service. But as more survivors trickled in, each telling the same horrific story, with the same core details, Varus's arrogance, the shortcut through the forest, the betrayal of Arminius, the ambush, the massacre, the terrible truth began to coalesce. The commanders on the Rhine, men like Lucius Nonius Asprenas, Varus's nephew, realized they were facing the greatest military disaster to befall Rome in generations. Panic gripped the frontier. The fear was that Arminius, his victory total, would now unite the tribes and sweep across the Rhine, bringing the war into the heart of Roman Gaul. Defenses were frantically organized, bridges were secured, and a desperate, urgent message was dispatched south. The news traveled along the empire's magnificent road system, carried by the imperial post, a relay of fast-moving couriers who could cover hundreds of miles a day. It flew south, through the cities of Gaul, over the Alps, and down the length of Italy. With every mile it traveled, it carried its payload of doom closer to the center of the world, the city of Rome itself. When the dispatch finally arrived at the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, it was delivered into the hands of the one man who embodied the power and pride of the empire more than any other, the Emperor Augustus. The impact on the aging emperor was devastating. Augustus was now in his 70s. He had spent a lifetime building his empire, ending the civil wars, and establishing a new era of peace and stability, the Pax Romana. He had overseen the expansion of Rome's frontiers, and the conquest of Germania was meant to be one of the crowning achievements of his long reign, a project started by his beloved stepson Drusus and continued by Tiberius. He had believed the province was pacified, on the verge of being fully integrated into the empire. The news from the Teutoburg Forest was not just a report of a military defeat, it was a direct, personal blow that shattered the central tenets of his life's work. The historian Suetonius describes the scene of the emperor's reaction. There was no stoic reserve, no calm acceptance of a military setback. There was only profound, unrestrained grief and rage. The loss of the men was a tragedy, but the loss of the eagles was a sacrilege. The disgrace was absolute. The emperor, the supreme commander of all Roman forces, was so overcome that he neglected his own appearance for months, refusing to cut his hair or shave his beard as a sign of deep mourning. The palace, usually a place of stately order, became the haunt of a grief-stricken old man. The news sent shockwaves of disbelief and horror through the entire city. The invincibility of the legions, a core component of the Roman identity, had been shattered. Fear, an emotion that had not been felt in the capital for decades, returned. People worried that the Germans were about to invade Italy itself, a terrifying echo of the Cimbrian and Teutonic invasions that had threatened the Republic a century before. The city guard was put on high alert. The great, confident heart of the empire had been pierced, and it was bleeding fear. The news of the Varian disaster, as it came to be known, did not just wound the Emperor Augustus politically, it broke something deep within him. This was not the calculated grief of a statesman mourning a strategic loss. This was the raw, visceral anguish of a patriarch who had lost his sons, a builder who had seen his masterwork defiled. The palace on the Palatine Hill, the nerve center of the known world, became a prison of sorrow for the aging emperor. The man who had projected an image of divine calm and unshakable authority for over 40 years was reduced to a figure of profound and public grief. According to the Roman historian Suetonius, the emperor's reaction was both dramatic and deeply revealing. He tore his robes in a fit of despair, a gesture of extreme mourning usually reserved for personal family tragedy. For Augustus, the legions were his family, and their loss was a personal bereavement. The carefully constructed facade of the stoic, untouchable princeps crumbled, revealing the vulnerable old man beneath. He was haunted by the scale of the failure, but more so by the name of the man he had entrusted with his legions and his grand vision for Germania. The halls of the imperial palace, once filled with the confident hum of governance, now echoed with a single, desperate, and obsessive cry. Augustus was said to have wandered the long, marble corridors for months, a ghost in his own home, often stopping to bang his head against a door or a wall in a physical manifestation of his mental torment. And as he did, he would cry out the same words, over and over again, a lament that would be immortalized by history: Quinctilius Varus, legions red. Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions. This cry was the heart of his grief. It was not just a demand for the return of his soldiers. It was a cry of bewilderment, of rage, of a trust so completely shattered that it bordered on madness. It was the cry of a man betrayed. He had personally chosen Varus. He had given him the command, the authority, the power. He had believed in him. And Varus, through his arrogance and incompetence, had led 3 of Rome's finest legions, 15,000 of its sons, into oblivion. The demand to give them back was the impossible, irrational plea of a man confronting a loss so total that it defied comprehension. He was not just mourning the dead, he was raging against the irreversible stupidity that had caused their deaths. The emperor's grief manifested in public policy as well. A state of emergency was declared. Fearing a mass Germanic invasion of Gaul and even Italy, Augustus scrambled to raise new troops. But the disaster had so terrified the Roman populace that there were few volunteers. The emperor had to resort to a draft, and when men refused to enlist, he punished them with heavy fines, confiscation of property, and in some cases, even execution. He was forced to conscript veterans and even freed slaves to fill the ranks, a desperate measure for a desperate time. He dispatched his most capable remaining general, his stepson Tiberius, to the Rhine to stabilize the frontier and prevent the disaster from spreading. Every year, on the anniversary of the battle, Augustus would observe it as a day of deep and solemn mourning. It became a permanent scar on his reign, a dark shadow that fell over the final years of his life. The Varian disaster was more than a military defeat, it was the death of a dream. The dream of a Roman Empire that would stretch to the Elbe River, a dream of a fully Romanized Germania, died in that forest with Varus and his men. Augustus, the master architect of the empire, had finally found a border he could not cross, a people he could not tame. His grief was for his lost soldiers, for his tarnished honor, but it was also the grief of a man confronting the limits of his own power, a lesson delivered in the most brutal and bloody way imaginable. The emperor's cry would echo through history, a permanent and haunting reminder of the day the forest swallowed 3 Roman legions whole. In the wake of the disaster, as the initial shock and grief began to settle into a cold, hard reality, the Roman state had to perform a grim and unprecedented piece of administrative housekeeping. An army is more than just men. It is a collection of units, each with its own number, its own history, its own identity. And when a unit ceases to exist in such a catastrophic and shameful manner, its very name must be dealt with. The fate of the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th legions was not just to be mourned, but to be officially and permanently erased in the military archives of Rome, where the rolls of every legion were meticulously kept. A line was drawn through their names. The numbers 17, 18, and 19 were declared damnatio memoriae, a condemnation of memory. They were struck from the official list of Roman legions, never to be raised again. This was the ultimate administrative punishment, an act that transformed these once proud units into ghosts, into specters that would haunt the Roman military for centuries. To speak their numbers was to invoke a story of shame, terror, and annihilation. This act was deeply significant. The Roman military was steeped in tradition and superstition. Numbers were not just numbers, they carried the weight of history, of victories won and honors earned. For a number to be deemed so unlucky, so cursed by its association with a single event, was a testament to the profound psychological trauma the Varian disaster had inflicted upon the Roman psyche. New legions would be raised to replace the lost manpower. The 21st Rapax and the 22nd Dioteriana were among them, but the cursed numbers were left vacant, a permanent, empty space in the Roman order of battle. These ghost legions became a cautionary tale, a story told to new recruits in hushed tones in the barracks of frontier forts from Britain to Syria. They were a reminder of the price of arrogance, of the dangers of underestimating an enemy, and of the horrors that lurked in the dark, untamed corners of the world. The story of their demise became a part of military lore, a foundational myth of failure that stood in stark contrast to the endless tales of Roman victory. The physical loss of the men was a demographic catastrophe, but the symbolic loss of their units was a wound that festered in the heart of the army. For the families of the fallen, there were no bodies to bury, no graves to visit. Their loved ones had simply vanished into a German forest, their final resting place unknown and desecrated. The erasure of their legions from the official rolls was a second death, a confirmation that their sacrifice had been made in the service of a failure so complete that it had to be expunged from the records. The ghost legions served as a permanent, institutional scar. Every time a list of the empire's military forces was read out, their absence would be felt. Every time a new legion was formed and given a number, the leap over the forbidden numerals would be a silent acknowledgement of the disaster. They became a symbol of the limits of empire, a recognition that not all lands could be conquered, Not all peoples could be civilized in the Roman fashion. The Rhine River, which had once been seen as a temporary stopping point on the road to the Elbe, now hardened into a permanent frontier. The decision was made, first by Augustus and then confirmed by his successor Tiberius, that the empire would expand no further in this direction. The cost, as demonstrated by the fate of the Ghost Legions, was simply too high. The spirits of the 17th, 18th, and 19th, left to wander the Teutoburg Forest, would forever stand guard at the edge of the Roman world, a perpetual warning against the hubris that had led them to their doom.